Kia ora, everyone. Vince Minjares back for version 3 or step 3 or phase 3 of this 3-part series. Matt and Justine, we're back with you again. And this time we don't have a special guest. We're the special guests, I guess. Yeah, again, really excited for kind of a way to maybe put it all together for you. You know, we've had a session with a college coach. We've had a session with some Kiwis who went over to different experiences and different levels and had a, quite diverse experiences, I suppose, in the sense of playing at different schools and having different levels, competing at different levels, having different academic interests. The purpose of this session is really to try to kind of take all the things you learned from those 2 sessions and combine it with Matt, Justine, and I's experience advising players and families on the recruitment process itself. And I won't, we won't go through a laundry list of who we've worked with, but it is safe to say that we've worked with a lot of athletes and a lot of parents in particular, manage the process. In some cases, all 3 of us have been very directly involved in advising the decision of players. In other cases, we've advised or just offered insight into some aspect of the decision-making process. But the reality is that it is a complex process and there's a lot of information to take in. I think the cool thing that we'll do for you today is we'll kind of lay out a big picture kind of frame, and then we'll go really year by year through the process, starting with year 10 of high school and then kind of progressing each year along the path in terms of the things you need to know, the information that you need to be accessing, and the little check boxes that you need to hit on if you want, to really have this option be there for you. Now, of course, there is an honest reality to all this. No matter what we say, going through this process still won't guarantee you a scholarship. All it does is put you in the position, should your basketball game be good enough as a player, to be able to receive a scholarship and to go to a school that really creates the right experience for you. And I think, we'll definitely hit on all those points as we go along. So Matt and Justine, do you want to share a few comments here before I kind of kick it off around the session today and what you're hoping to share?
Just evening, everybody. Excited to be here. I think the first 2 conversations we've had, a lot of really good feedback from, which is good to know. But yeah, I guess just, from my experience going through, again, advising and talking with families and players, through my time at Rosmini and a little bit with Harbour, and then, leaning on very early on Justine's insight and if, the more recent years working closely with Vince on a number of players. Just wanting to, share that insight and the process that we go through and hopefully, you might be able to pick up a few things along the way. But yeah, no, just excited to get stuck in and also answering any questions that you guys have that might not be covered on the slides.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I'm the same as well. Just, I think this is a kind of great opportunity for any player to, that wants to continue playing basketball after high school and get an education. So I think it is something that I've always kind of supported and thought was a good pathway. Sorry. Just like Vince and Matt have said, we're just here to help in any way we can. So yeah, looking forward to today.
Cool. So we'll get going. Just as a reminder, please keep yourselves on mute. If you have a question, post it to the chat. We will stop periodically as we go along to address any questions. So like if it comes up at any moment, just throw it in, and we'll address it, particularly if it's in line with the topic we're on. In some cases, we might wait to hold off on a question because it will probably be answered in another section. But just throw it out there and don't hold back, don't hesitate. Thanks for those of you who've already sent in questions. So I'm gonna get the ball rolling here by sort of walking you through, apologies. Walking you through, I suppose, the big picture of the recruitment kind of journey. And it's about sort of setting a reminder and sort of setting an intention. Having spent probably 15 years in this world of college basketball recruitment, initially for me, it was working with American college players who wanted to go to the US, and it was working with college athletes in the system. So for those who don't know, I spent 5 years at the University of California, Berkeley, where I was where I was a student athlete development officer. And I oversaw support programs for Division I men's basketball and women's basketball players. And so I sort of also saw it on that side, where I got to meet with recruits who were interested in coming to our school, and obviously spent many years working with athletes who were going through the experience. And the one thing I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt is that one of the biggest mistakes that people make in this process is that they've used the scholarship purely as success without thinking about the experience that you get after that. And if there's one thing you take away from this, from me particularly, it would be that the goal here is to end up in a place where you can have a great college experience that includes not just basketball, but also your a really good lifestyle and a great academic opportunity. And you've got to be intentional about that. So to help you sort of think of what we mean by that, consider for a second what kind of the ideal scenario would be, and the why of actually going to the US. On the one hand, you obviously have this, for those of you who are maybe unsure, you're like, why should I do this? Why should I want to go to the US? I mean, the honest reality is you're going to get a chance to play at a very high level. You're going to get to continue challenging yourself in a way that doesn't exist here in New Zealand. It doesn't mean there's not good players here. It doesn't mean you can't get better here. But the honest reality is that the American college basketball system doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And that is quite literal. No other place in the world can you actually compete in high performance sport for your university while studying full time. And so that is a very unique proposition. And that means, the cool thing about the US is there's a lot of good players. There's a lot of people who play basketball. There's a lot of very talented players, which means you get to be challenged at a higher level than you would normally see in New Zealand. There's a lot more resource and support. I think about the quality of the Division III gym that I played at, which probably at the time when I played is not very big, but if you go to the school that I played at now, there's a 3,000 seat gymnasium for a Division III school. And that's, how many 3,000 seat arenas do we have in New Zealand, Matt and Justine, and that's a Division III school, let alone a Division I or II. Cal Berkeley had a 10,000 seat arena, $7 million athletic budget, $70 million athletic budget, coach making $2 million a year. The reality is you have people who invest a lot of money into sport and believe in sport as part of the academic and educational experience. So you have a lot more resource, dedicated strength and conditioning facilities, dedicated larger coaching staffs. Even in smaller schools, there's a couple of kids, I think about Kiani is at LSU, Eunice, which is a junior college in Louisiana. And his school's got a really nice gym. It's not as big as the ones I'm talking about, but it's a nice gym. It's got fiberglass backboards. It's got, really nice floor. I think that, for those of you who are saying, okay, I know that basketball is great in the US. I think academically, it's important to consider what that pathway offers you. America does have a number of the best universities in the world. And in general, the American university system is different. It is actually different. One of the things that people need to know is that, universities in America go on a 4-year program as opposed to the universities in New Zealand, which are 3-year. The biggest thing that means is that when you go to a 4-year university, you spend 2 years discovering your specialization, your major. Whereas in New Zealand, you need to kind of know your major before you actually enroll, or right when you start. In the US, they give you time. So you get 2 years of what we call general education, then you specialize in the back 2 years. And that 2-year early phase is important for making sure that you choose the thing that you love and that you really want to study. Of course, it also means that you actually get a breadth of education that's not too specialized in one field. So you get a bit of best of both worlds. I get a specialization and I get a broad-based kind of 2-year general education period. I think anyone who's gone through the process of trying to get qualifications recognized, one of the things to know is that bachelor's degrees from four-year universities in particular are internationally recognized, including both in Australia and New Zealand. There is some caveats here. If you want to go into a very specialized field, like for instance, teaching, or I think Justine, you brought up, physio, there are some fields where you need to do extra study here. And so it is important for you to if you know what field you want to go into, to know what the New Zealand requirements are. But generally speaking, a bachelor's degree from a four-year university in the United States will transfer to employment across large portions of the world, particularly Western countries like Australia and New Zealand. I'll just add a couple other things here around lifestyle. It's really important to know that you're going to spend 4 years on a campus, living, eating, studying with a small group of people, but who are part of a big community. And I think one of the things that we love about not just universities, but also American college sports in particular, is you just got a lot of support. So, that sort of big, fun, vibrant, campus environment is something that, means you get to spend 4 years with other 20-somethings who are trying to figure out how to become an adult and making mistakes, but they're doing it in a way that's supported by a campus environment. So there's lots of resources on these campuses to help kids learn how to become independent. And that would make for a memorable overseas experience. I guess finally, the one thing I'll say, and again, ask questions about this stuff as we go through, but if you can get a scholarship, obviously that sets you up potentially to earn your degree without debt. And so that's a situation that's desirable considering the number of folks who graduate with college loan debt. And we also know that if you get a bachelor's degree, statistically speaking, you're going to earn about $1 million or more over your lifetime than you would if you had the next level down, which would be like a junior college degree or a trade qualification. So bachelor's degrees earn you more money over time. So that's sort of the argument for it. It's not a perfect system. There's a lot of flaws. It is America after all, and we know it's not the perfect place. But there are a lot of good things about the American college system, particularly if you get to a four-year university, that are really, really valuable. So think about some of those questions. Think about some of this as we go through it. Before I hand it over to Matt, I'll just walk through a couple of things about what we think that means for your recruitment process. One is that when you get to the end point, you don't want to be just looking at, am I being offered a scholarship? You want to be asking questions about what life is going to be like. And so that means you want to be asking more specific basketball questions than just, am I good enough to play for you? You want to be at a point where you have the options and you can compare schools on some of these things. You certainly want to have a sense for, the fit of the school academically, basketball wise, and socially and culturally. So you need to make sure that you're going to an environment where you're going to enjoy playing there, right? Style of play, coaching style, atmosphere of the team, and of course, an opportunity to actually play. Academically, you need to know what you're getting yourself into in terms of what's the quality of the school, what's the learning environment. So what's the typical class size? Are there other international students who go to the school? Is the school religiously affiliated? Some schools have a religious affiliation, and that impacts the curriculum and the courses you have to take. There are Mormon schools, there are Jesuit schools, there's Catholic schools. Those schools will make you take certain courses or follow a certain lifestyle. I know that Matt can probably talk a little bit about Will's experience now at Dallas Baptist, which is a Baptist school that has very strict kind of lifestyle requirements of students. And so, even from that perspective, when you get to the point of selecting a school, and I know I'm kind of I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but it is important to know that, where you are in the world matters. Is this a place that has weather I like? Is this a place, where I can connect to the community? Does it remind me of home, or do I want to get far away from home? I think that there are any number of potential kinds of situations. I know that, just talking to Zach Riley, at a certain point, he realized, I want to be in a city. I don't want to be in a rural town far away from everything. So, that matters. Your living arrangement matters. Do I have a 10-minute walk to class, or do I have to take a 30-minute bus ride to class? That matters. So I suppose, we want you to, again, think, to get the message here that when you go through this exposure recruitment journey, you want to be able to put yourself in a position where you have options and you can select the one that presents the best fit and the greatest combined experience, so that at the end of 4 years, you can come away with a degree, having made some friends, and certainly having played played good basketball in an environment that works for you. There are a lot of places to do that. And so the thing to know that is that don't narrowly confine yourself to one level or tier, assuming that your academics are in line and qualify you. The one thing that we'll say is, obviously there's super high majors and there's Division I's. There are very good Division II schools out there. There are very good NAIA schools. And we're learning now with Rehana's experience and Marvin's experience. And I know there's a number of girls who've ended up at Division II schools where it's like, hey, there are good basketball environments and good academic situations that you can end up at. So learn how they all work and then figure out the one that's best for you by creating options. The one thing I will say is that we do tend to talk about eligibility academically, and Matt's going to really break this down on a year-to-year standpoint. We do talk about eligibility mainly with reference to the NCAA. And so if I'll just go back to this very quickly, the NCAA is one of 3 major associations. Each of them technically has different academic requirements, but the NCAA has the most strict. And so we reference them primarily because if you complete their requirements, you're basically going to complete the other requirements. And in some instances, that creates the most options for you. Is that fair? That fair to say, Matt?
Yeah, for sure.
So this is the big thing to know here, and Matt's going to walk you through this in more detail. I'll just give you the high level piece. In order to be eligible for the NCAA, your best bet is to pass the 16 subject areas that are required over 4 years. So from year 10 to year 13, you're required to complete 16 subject areas. Completion means passing with achievement or better. Matt will walk through the details of that. Your combined marks on those produce a GPA, and that GPA needs to be what's considered 2.3 or higher. That is the minimum requirement. We don't think you should aim for the minimum. We think you should aim for a 3.0 or higher, which will increase opportunities for you. Don't compete to the bottom. Pursue, challenge yourself and do well. The other thing to know is that there is a standardized test requirement. This just needs to be completed before you graduate. Most students will take it in year 12 or 13. That normally is the SAT. The SAT is completed on, you can get a score of 1600 or better. And again, the better you do on this, the more options you'll have. But you have to achieve a minimum score to be eligible. Usually that minimum is quite low, but it can vary based on your GPA. We generally suggest trying to get 1,000 or higher. And again, if you can get maybe 12, 1300, you really increase your options. So I will pause there. Matt and Jess, you want to throw some stuff in there that I missed or that you want to emphasize before we get into this?
The only thing I thought of was just in regards to the academics, and like Vince said, we'll go through that in more detail. But if you find yourself in a situation, there might be a year 13 on the call, or maybe even someone older who's still looking at the pathway, and you're already thinking, oh, I don't have all of those things. There's certainly there's certainly ways to get around that and to do things to kind of make up for lost ground. One of those things is if you don't have year 13, you don't necessarily have to have that. You can get in or be eligible based off of year 12. So this is the perfect scenario. This is kind of checking all the boxes, but if you miss a box, don't feel like it's the end of the road for you.
I think the only thing I wanted to add also is that, and I think it's on the slide, but down the bottom is that actually, aiming for 3.0 is a merit average. And so just thinking about that is that, so, in New Zealand, I find that, I never did NCEA, but I think that's quite a, it's quite a tough or a harder, anyway, standard to achieve. I don't know, Vince, did you want to answer any of these questions?
Yeah.
now?
So I'm just seeing them here.
Yeah.
So yeah, Tony, great question. So there are a lot of universities in the US, and there are a few ways to evaluate them. Generally speaking, the higher so if you look at international rankings in particular, the highest ranked universities are going to be national universities. These tend to be large research universities where the majority of the faculty have PhDs, and really they're in the US, there's a concept called a land-grant university. So if you hear about like University of Virginia or University of California, these universities tend to be the highest ranks, or kind of national private universities. So like Stanford, Harvard, those kind of schools. In terms of evaluating kind of how the degrees and whatnot transfer, besides rankings, I know New Zealand in particular does have a list of kind of a process that they go through of recognizing qualifications from international universities. They do have a list. If you go to Immigration New Zealand's website, and NZQA, they'll actually reference you to lists of universities whose degrees are valued at what's called kind of tier 7. So tier 7 is like basically gets you 70 points. I think that might be it. I might be wrong. 50 points. It gets you 50 points. Which is particularly for people who are trying to get jobs through their overseas degrees. There is a sort of a tiering system where bachelor's degrees get more than kind of qualifications below that, but there isn't a university list there, and it includes a lot of universities. If your university isn't on that list, then you can get your degree assessed by the NZQA, and then they can determine its sort of viability. So there are some processes there. I know Australia has a very similar process. In terms of the religious question, religious schools do recruit students who are not of that religion. So you do not have to be Catholic or Jesuit to go to a Catholic or Jesuit school. Same with a school like BYU. You don't have to be Mormon to go to BYU, but you have to follow their code of conduct. So you don't get to opt out of that if you're not Mormon.
Vince, just one thing on that. There's a few Rosmini guys who are at a Baptist school, which is a little bit stricter in terms of the things that they have to do on a week-to-week basis. But Rayhan is at a Catholic university, and he actually, as a part of his scholarship, he actually got a Catholic grant because he went to a Catholic high school. So there can be sometimes funding available to those different kind of religious feeder schools or religious institutions.
Tui, in terms of your question about kind of academic scholarships, so yes, schools, particularly at Division II and Division III level, will offer you academic scholarships, NAIAs, where if you've got really, really good, standardized test scores and course marks, then you can get money for your academic achievement. I think the concept of playing basketball, coping with basketball while going high academic. I was at an institution like that. So I played Division III basketball at a school where all of my teammates were very academically motivated. Division III, one of the things that we know statistically is that the time commitment and the time demands for Division III are lower than Division II, which is lower than Division I. So there's a kind of recognition that some of these levels, that these aren't professional athletes. They're people who just want to keep playing at a high level, and they take their academics very seriously. That's also true of high academic schools, even at the Division I level. So a school like Northwestern, Ivy League schools, Isaac Latoa went to Dartmouth, which is a very good academic school out of Westlake, and has studied architecture there. It is doable. It's just a question of what do you want to do? Like, do you want to play at a high level and pursue your academics? It's doable. It's very doable. You just got to be on it. You got to really have a good system and a good process. You got to make sacrifices socially. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say I've known a few girls that have gone over where actually some of the degrees the school or the coaches or the program doesn't recommend them taking it just because of the course load. So if you're looking at stuff like engineering and I think pre-med's okay because you're not doing the doctor's degree, you're just doing a science degree. But yeah, it's always good to check with the school as well if you're wanting to pursue that path.
Yeah, I would add to that, at Berkeley, when I was at Berkeley's a very good academic school, and we would often have students come in thinking they were going to take study a particular thing. And they very quickly realized what was and wasn't doable. And one of the things that needs to be looked at is if you are very academically minded and you want to have a really, you want to challenge yourself academically, you really need to be clear. And you might have to ask the coaches some hard questions about, I want to pursue this field. What if there's a conflict? What if I can't make training because I have a study group or something of that nature? You'll know in the recruiting process whether or not a coach is genuine about that. But a lot of coaches sometimes will kind of say the right thing to get you on campus. So you really need to kind of investigate that question with academic advisors and with academic counselors. Most schools have a person who advises student athletes on their academic choices. That was literally my job, or at least one part of my job. And we knew which fields were doable and what weren't for competitive athletes. In terms of weekly time commitments, what I would say is, and I would recommend kind of maybe listening to the girls chat, because I know that was addressed kind of later, but realistically, every day you've got a team training. You have basically one day off a week. The rest of the time you have probably 2 to 3 hours of training, which could be combined, which could be entirely on court, or it's usually a combination of on court and strength training. You lift basically all the time. And we do know statistically that, like, on average, Division I and Division II athletes, even Division III, are in the kind of 35 to 40 hours a week of organized team activity, including training, competition, travel, so forth. So you can expect probably 6 hours a day of stuff, even if it's not just purely competition and training. It could be physio, it could be meetings with coaches, it could be video analysis, it could be community service and marketing, promotional stuff. Like, there's a lot of stuff. It's a very intense workload, no matter what level you're at. Cool. Great. Keep the questions coming. This is awesome. Okay, so we're going to transition to Matt, and Matt is going to walk us through kind of the year-by-year guide. So take it away, Matt. You want me to just go to the first slide?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll I guess just kind of jump right in, and this is kind of just off the back of my own experience, and these are the types of conversations that I have had, at different ages with different, players and their families. And this is kind of the way that I would go about it. It's definitely not a one-stop shop. And, Justine and Vince, just kind of jump in and add your 2 cents where you feel fit. But we'll start at year 10, and we'll get into subject selection kind of just right after this slide. But there's not really a whole lot to it at year 10. It's it's really about just growing your love for the game, having fun, enjoying the sport. I think that kind of to Vince's point, so far there's a lot going on when you get to college, and you really have to love basketball to be doing it all day, every day. And there's a lot of pulling factors when you're there living that life. So I think just having that love for the game is crucial. We encourage kids to continue to play multiple sports if that's what they want to do. And so yeah, year 10 is really just about taking the right subjects, and like I said, we'll get to that next. But just building that love and desire to play basketball. The off season, we'll talk a little bit about the times between each year. So the time period between year 10 and 11, again, not too serious. There might be starting to, you might start to think about specialized skill development, maybe working with a coach, putting extra time into your game, or just, even getting just down to the kind of the park, or joining in extra scrimmages. But just kind of starting to think about doing something that you love all the time. But again, nothing really too structured or too intense in that way, at least in terms of like a requirement or what we say you should be doing in order to achieve this thing. It's still very much kind of fun and just kind of enjoying it. So if we just kind of push to the next slide, this is where, from a subject selection perspective, it's important to know that when the NCAA assesses your eligibility to obtain a scholarship, and again, this is a Division I conversation, the requirements at lower levels are less so, but if you meet these requirements, you should meet most things. So they will look at your academic record on a 4-year period. And so that's why we talk about it from the start of year 10. So a typical, obviously, Kiwi student graduates at the end of year 13. So those are the 4 years that we talk about. There are 5 main subject categories, and those are studying English for 4 years. So all 4 of those year 10 through 13 years, then studying maths for 3 years, studying natural and physical science. So your general sciences, your chemistry, your biology, and your physics, that's 2 years, social science for 2, and then what they call additional courses. And we'll get to what that means in a second.
Matt, sorry, can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
For anyone that's at Kura Kaupapa Māori, if you're doing some of the Māori courses, and I can't remember the names, but that can actually go towards the English requirement. So yeah, just for anyone that's at Kura Kaupapa Māori.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So English is pretty self-explanatory, you know, for, I don't know if it's mandatory in year 12, but I think at years 10 and 11 it is. So that's pretty straightforward. Math, obviously, again, quite straightforward at years 10 and 11. Years 12 and 13, you can start to, you know, specialize into statistics and calculus. You'll see there in terms of the subject examples, we've put there are some math courses that you might get advised to take if you know, if you're struggling or if math doesn't come naturally to you. There are some courses like applied mathematics that wouldn't meet NCAA standards. And in the follow-up email to this Zoom, we'll send out a really informative guide to work out what course titles you can and can't take. And it gets down into really the detail of what the words and the title of the course refer to. So math for 3 years, natural and physical science. So again, your chem, your bio, your physics. At later years that you might specialize in, earth and space science is something that a lot of our guys at Rosmini ended up taking, that is approved. And again, there's some detail on that course, but also a few other science courses in the guide that we'll send out. That 1 year additional is just an additional year of either English, math, or natural physical science. I think Zach Riley's a good example of someone that he likes science. I think that came naturally to him. Vince, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, I think he took 2 sciences in his year 12 and 13 year. So he would over the course of his 4 years at high school, he would have ended up with more than 2 natural physical sciences. So he could use one of those additional years to fill that 4th column over. Social science, this is you know, quite straightforward. Again, you'll do social science in years 10, social studies in 10 and 11 most likely, and then you'll get into some subject selections. Interestingly, accounting is one that isn't recognized.
Even though
The heck?
Yeah.
So, you know, for us, that's on, you know, university entrance in New Zealand. It is approved, and for a lot of kids, it is something that they take, particularly if you're wanting to do, you know, an accounting degree.
I think it's writing for Solly.
All right, Justine.
It's okay. And then, yeah, so social science is again straightforward once you kind of know what fits within that. And then the additional courses are anything that we've kind of spoke about. So English, math, science, social science, anything additional. So if you've done, you know, 4 years of social science, in that kind of 5th column there, you're only required 2. So you'd have 2 years left over. You can put those towards your additional courses. So anything left over from the 4 main categories, you can shift over to additional courses. And then subjects like languages and philosophy are also included in the additional core course requirement there that has 4 years. So, you know, Māori, Japanese, French, you know, you name it, they all are recognized there. So just to kind of wrap this up, and Vince, Justine, kind of feel free to jump in. And if there are any questions, we can address those now in terms of academics. But when we say 4 years of English, if we break that down to a year by year scenario, you know, if you're in year 13, in order to get your year 13 year of English, you need to obtain 12 NCEA credits or more. And I think that's a really important thing to note, because it actually shows how achievable this is. I think the challenge that we have is sometimes when we get kids too late that have taken the wrong subjects early, that can be a little bit hard to make up, although not impossible. But if you take the right subjects, it's very, very achievable to not only obtain, you know, the minimum GPA, but to get a good GPA. A lot of subjects in New Zealand, you know, for English, math, whatever it is, you're often entered into 20, 24 credits per year per subject. So you're really only having to get 12 of those to meet the minimum standard, half. That second point there, so on the kind of the equivalent in the US, a merit is a 3.0, and that's what Justine referred to previously, and an excellence is a perfect 4.0. You know, a number of the Rosmini kids I've coached have had 4.0 GPAs, and they do work hard, and they are, you know, they are intelligent, but you know, we won't get into too many details of how it's calculated and how many credits are taken, but it's actually very, very achievable to have a high GPA if you take the right subjects. And then just that last note there, Division 2 has less academic requirements, NAI has different academic requirements, and then junior college has almost no academic requirements. So that can be a route for you if you're struggling to kind of meet the criteria here. Anything to add, Vince, Justine?
Just go ahead.
I did have something, I can't remember off the, sorry, someone's I was just going to say, I think in the first instance, when the NCAA are assessing, they want to take it from the learning record, which I think is from your year 11 to year 13 grades. And so that's what they'll use first. But then if they can't find it from there, then they'll go and look at year 9 and 10s. So yeah, just something to think about.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to add was, not at the risk of adding more confusion to this, because I'm sure some people are like, their heads are like, oh my gosh, I'm spinning. How do I know? You know, it's still confusing, and it is probably still confusing. It is still confusing. I actually want to add in that there's 2 layers to the eligibility process. The first layer is what Matt's talking about, which is eligibility for a scholarship according to the NCAA. And the NCAA is the National Collegiate Athletic Association. They're the governing body for universities that are part of that association. And there's over 1,000 universities. There's 300 at the Division I level. What the NCAA is saying is that if you want an athletic scholarship from one of these schools, you have to meet these requirements. However, the schools can have even stricter requirements than that to gain admission to the university. So admission is actually something different from just eligibility. So you might be like, hey, look, I'm eligible. I got my I completed all my subject areas. I got my 3.0 GPA. I passed with a 1,000 SAT. And then a school like Stanford comes along, or a school that, or an Ivy League school, or a good, you know, Division II academic school that says, sorry, 3.0 is actually not strong enough for our school. Yes, it's strong enough for you to get a scholarship according to the NCAA, but we are looking at students who are getting, you know, 3.5s or 3.8s or 4.0s. And we are looking for students who are getting, you know, 1,200 or 1,400 SATs. If you want to come to our school, you need to do more than what the NCAA says. You actually need to do as good as what we look at. Now, maybe, and this is true, that being a scholarship level athlete or being a player who's good enough to play on the sports team can sometimes result in some admission by exception situations. And having been at Cal, that definitely was something for us. You might have an All-American level, football player or basketball player who's maybe they're not a 3.9 or a 4.2 like most Berkeley students, but they might be a 3.2 or even a 2.8. And they're like, hey, you know what? We will bring you in as an exception because you add something to our community that those students don't, which is you have basketball ability. Yes, Kurt, we will add that in as well, that if you can't gain admission or NCAA eligibility, so let's say you can't meet these eligibility requirements, which happens. Some people just don't think about this until too late, or they struggle with the SAT, or they're just not great in school. Well, one way of navigating that is to go junior college. So junior college generally only requires, in high school, they just only require you to have graduated high school, which, in New Zealand, it's probably like a level 2 equivalent would be my guess. I don't actually, do you know what's required? It is.
Yeah.
Right. That's what I thought. So if you complete level 2, then that makes you eligible for junior college. Then you basically spend anywhere from 1 to 2, some cases 3, depending on your health situation, at a junior college, completing the general education requirements, and then transferring to a 4-year university. That is a way of still getting to a 4-year university without being admitted as right after high school. And obviously, we have a lot of students in New Zealand who are going junior college. A lot of them, and junior college is different. It is different. It is a place where, there are fewer students who live on campus. Most students are part-time students at a junior college. Most students commute to school. Most students you have a lot more students who go to junior college who maybe struggled in school or financially struggling, so on and so forth. So there are a number of differences between junior colleges and 4 years. The biggest one being the academic requirements required to enter and the status of students on school.
Cool. Well, I think if I can just kind of wrap up this piece, it would be, if you're year 10, or to be fair, actually anywhere along your high school journey, if you can just try and ensure that you're taking a subject in each of the 4 main core course areas, which is English, math, natural science, and social science, you'll be fine, as long as you work a little bit hard. But if you're year 10, those decisions are almost always made for you. And then as you obviously, progress through high school, you'll get more decision-making capacity. And then you can use your 5th subject choice to potentially make up for some things that either you failed or you didn't take, or just give yourself more margin for error, as we take 5 and sometimes 6 subjects in high school each year here in New Zealand. So, anything to finish on that before we move on to?
I just was going to say, I do have the international course title usage doc here, and I might just very, very quickly just show people what that looks like, just really quickly. So I'm just going to share. So this document is the document for reference around international course title usage. And I know there was a question in there about digital technologies. The big thing to know is that basically, your course, so that course would not be eligible under this framework because the word technology is in the title. Effectively, I think what we found is that what the NCAA and what American colleges are doing is they want you to take what's called college preparatory coursework. And the biggest way of thinking about that is they don't want you taking applied coursework. So you'll note that in a lot of this language, a lot of it is in reference to areas of study that are, I would say more vocational or more applied. They want you taking courses, and again, so approved course titles that can be used here, you'll note that these are more like foundational courses. So they want you taking theory they want you taking theory. And I think that's where, you note something like accounting, which is great, is actually an applied field for business, finance, so forth. It's not considered a social science in the same way as something like economics or government is. And I think that's just an important distinction. So we'll share this document with you. It's also available on the NCAA website.
Cool.
And I'll go back to our.
Just, you good with that?
Yep.
Cool. So as we move into year 11, a lot is actually really similar. You might try to kind of wrap your head around NCAA eligibility a little bit more. We've kind of gone very high level here. It might not seem like it, but that's kind of just a broad overview of the academics. You might start thinking about GPA and how to track that. You might start trying to research a little bit more around registering for the Eligibility Center, getting your amateurism process started. So there's a few more things that you can potentially start to upskill yourself on in terms of understanding how the process works. Continue to take the required subjects. That document right there is just gold in terms of, informing your decision. But then it's kind of the same thing, continue to have fun playing basketball. I think particularly for boys and just maybe might want to comment for girls in terms of how this kind of timeline might apply slightly different to them, but so much has to do with your physical development, the athleticism that you have, the physical attributes that you have will play a lot in determining what level coaches will see you being able to play at in the US, that you can't rush that, right? So often, sometimes we will know by year 11, but sometimes we won't know, where kind of everything will land in terms of that side of things. So definitely encouraging, extra training. I think multi-sport at this age is still definitely acceptable. And I wouldn't, encourage my players that are passionate about another sport to stay away from that. But it is still only a few years away from potentially a life-changing experience. So it is starting to think about things in a more serious way. And you're also starting to think about capturing game film, particularly leading into your year 12 year. If you're a year 11 that's kind of finished the year and maybe didn't get the opportunity to capture that much, don't worry too much about that. I think if you're year 12, you definitely want to have some, but year 11, if you have some, that's a bonus. And then, before I hand over to you, maybe talking about the window of opportunity between your year 11 and 12. You want to finish the year well academically, do well in your exams. Again, start to just even think about the US landscape in a more detailed way, starting to learn about conferences and watch some games and, learn about different schools. What does high major, mid major, low major mean? Different levels. All of that is so accessible these days online. So it's really easy to get a basic understanding of that. But I would say this is one of two really important windows that are really left in your high school career, where you're not pulled in so many different directions because of the way that the New Zealand basketball calendar is structured. When you get into the heart of the season, particularly in terms 2 and 3, but even in term 1, it can be so busy that you don't really have a lot of time to focus on skill development and strength and conditioning. So that's something, off the back of my comment around physical maturity and development and how much of a factor that plays in terms of where you will end up. I just encourage my players and the families that I work with to really focus in on improving your game, but improving your body and laying some foundational work that you can potentially build on over the coming 12 to 24 months. That's super vital, in my opinion.
Just, do you want to talk about kind of the girls' side of this in terms of where year 11 sits I know that there's a lot of girls who are still playing multiple codes, and I might, after you, might talk a little bit about kind of athlete development models, but maybe you
Yeah.
can talk a little bit about like where this year sits in the bigger picture for
Yeah, I definitely think that this is a really important year for the girls. I think a lot of the time, and it's for whatever reason, girls aren't as, I guess, aware, or they're unsure yet if basketball's for them. So, you know, this, if possible, I try to talk to them. This is the kind of turning point for a lot of girls. You know, it's still okay to play sports, but I think there has to be that investment in, you know, that focused skill development, and again, strength and conditioning. I find a lot of the girls, and for whatever reason, don't start really getting serious about this path until kind of towards the end of year 12. And so they've lost 1 year, or, you know, of development that's just going to help them prepare better for this pathway. So I know, you know, that in some other sports, the level of skill development, such as netball, that you need isn't as high as what's required in basketball. And so there's a different kind of mindset that you have to take in terms of getting to the level that you need to get to, you know, if you want to play over in the States. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that. We've put the word investments period in here, and that is actually a technical term. So for anyone who's interested, there's an athlete development model called the Developmental Model of Sport Participation, and it's written by this academic named Jean Catet, who's from Canada. And that model basically is three stages. The first stage is sampling, which is basically, you know, for all intents and purposes, it's like birth to puberty. And that from birth to puberty, you basically are playing multiple sports, you're having fun, you're developing a range of skills, you're just enjoying playing sport, being physically active. Yeah, maybe you have a sport that you figure out you liked. I know I don't know about you, Matt, but when I was about, you know, I think I was 8, I was like, soccer, no thank you. Baseball, no thank you. Basketball was all that I wanted to play. But I was still in a sampling period because I wasn't year round. I hadn't specialized. So there's a difference between deciding there's a sport you love most and specializing. And I think the sampling period is a period where it's very play focused, it's enjoyable, it's about developing a nice foundation of athletic movement and you know, your core kind of what we call fundamental movement skills. There is a period around puberty, and again, we're kind of signaling year 11 as kind of the key points in time. Some will get to puberty before, some might be a delayed kind of mature where it doesn't happen, you know, really till year 12. And that might play a role in your decision. But year 10 going into year 11, we tend to find kids really starting to focus and really kind of, especially end of year 11, what you've done is you've invested in really a smaller number of codes. So instead of playing 5, I might now focus on 2. Or I might have one that's my main focus and do a little bit of the other one still on the side without fully specializing in one. And I'm definitely creating that window for me to put extra work in onto a focal 1 or 2 sports. And that process allows me to build a base of skill and to get good, right? I kind of decide I want to be good at this, that I really like this one. So, you know, certainly kind of year 11, bottom age 17s, you might have a few who are top age 15s. You know, you're really thinking about, you know, basketball. I think basketball is a sport I want to focus on. There will be a time to specialize, and for some it might be the next year, definitely year 13, where you know, I'm now kind of putting more investment into a focal thing. And I think that, you know, from my perspective, you know, focusing on a single sport or a small number of sports at age 11 is fine. You know, I know that there's been a lot of discussion around balance is better, and some of the questions around you're not allowed to specialize in a single sport. Really what balance is better is saying, and for those who don't know, I am a national trainer for Sport New Zealand, and you know, I was the lead trainer for Good Sports when it came out, so I'm well versed in the literature on this. The issue is early specialization. We don't want you focusing on one sport year round before puberty. But when you get to puberty and after you've sampled multiple sports, there does come points in time where you need to start reflecting on where are you going. And I might start narrowing my interests around year 10, year 11. Really what we're saying is year 11. And then as I get good, I might then decide, you know what, I'm really going to focus and I'm going to do this year round. I'm going to take it to another level. And Matt will talk about what that looks like, because really, it's really this, it's really this process. So happy to take more questions on that stuff as we go along, but there is a point in time where you need to start focusing. And if you do it around this point, around year 11, one of the things that will happen is you'll play better. You'll potentially be less injured because you're doing more strength and conditioning work on your body. You're probably rolling more. You're probably, doing more individual training where people are working with you on your habits and your mindset. This kind of process needs to happen. Yeah.
Cool. So as we progress into year 12, I think the idea in this year is that this is going to make up a lot of your really core game film in the early parts of your recruitment. It might be the type of film that you use to introduce yourself to a number of colleges or recruiters. And so your body is really developing at a fast rate. And you're also, sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. But I guess it's just really a time to really start to focus in on playing year round and putting, a lot more attention into the game. Obviously continue to take the required NCAA subjects, and this is where you'll have some options in terms of what you take or don't take. But I would say, you're starting to take a bit more of a primary role on either your school team or rep team, or maybe both. You're not that far away now from the start of a typical recruitment period. So you're really starting to think about taking that responsibility that comes with being one of the better players on your team in order to play well and to also, obviously get that film that you will need as you start to kind of progress through the exposure and recruitment piece. Vince, maybe do you want to chat a little bit about the performance habits before I move through to kind of that year 12, 13?
I think this is probably just kind of carrying on from what I was sort of just saying, which is that when you get to year 12, now you're really probably at that point where if you haven't been, you're on the senior team now at your school, if you're top age 17s, now if you're at Harbour, we've got a lot of good players. So not everybody who ends up being a college prospect, makes the top 17 team at this age. We certainly have a lot of late developers, and so biological maturity can sometimes have that. But you're playing at a high level in year 12, and you're playing. You might be on the cusp of a New Zealand team, or you might be on a New Zealand team. I think this is now in year 12 where you need to take your level of preparation, your level of process up a notch, and so that's where I'm prioritizing all the things I'm participating in. I'm actively working to prevent injury. I'm managing my loads, so I'm not putting myself in a situation where I'm doing things that are going to compromise my body. I'm actively thinking about hydration and recovery. I'm rolling before every session. I'm definitely engaged with a program or a person on my strength and conditioning, which might be 2 or 3 days a week. Even if it's in season, it might be 2 days, but it might be maintenance style work. And then certainly I've got a plan for how I'm going to maintain or build strength, throughout the year. Keeping in mind that this is the lifestyle that's expected of you in college. So one of the things that we want to really communicate, and one of the things that we know happens, is that we see, boys and girls get scholarships. They're certainly talented enough to get a scholarship. They go over, but they're not ready for the lifestyle. So they're not ready not only for the load, the amount of stuff, but actually they never lifted weights before. They've never had a 2.5 hour training session followed by a weight session followed by class. This is year 12 is really the year where it's like I'm preparing. I'm really kind of getting myself ready for a future in the sport. I want to play well now, but I want to actually build the habits and the lifestyle and the process that helps me play well, but also prepares me for future opportunities. And I know that having been having seen guys come into Cal and girls who were simply completely unprepared, and they're the ones who get off on the wrong foot. Then they play poorly, their body's not ready, they're not fit, and then the coaches are like, "Ooh, they're not what we thought they were," and sometimes those players don't recover from that, you know. And I think that, you know, this is why we're not saying you need to start this process at 10 years old. We're not saying you need to start this process at 12 or 13 years old, but around mid to late high school is when you want to start making that transition to actually building a lifestyle around this process. If you do it too early, it can actually have an adverse effect, because then you actually could burn out. But if you move into this process, you know, kind of mid to late high school, that's when you start to actually, you'll be focused on it, you'll identify with it, you'll kind of be in a better place to do something with it. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing? You know, when I'm coaching teams and stuff, a lot of kids will say, I can't make a training because I've got a test, or I've got homework, or I missed something. And I never allow that as an excuse, because that's not an excuse at college. So it's really important that you learn how to, you know, that management as well, academically, with the basketball as well. So just wanted to put that in there.
I did not miss one high school basketball practice in my entire career. And that's never for academics, you know, maybe for the odd injury, but it's right. It's your job to manage your academics and your basketball and your social life. And, you know, when you're a young person, you know, yeah, it's hard. It is hard. You know, it's definitely not easy, but people do it. People around the world do it. And there's a lot of resources and support for it.
Yeah, nice. Well, I think as we kind of progress from there into the end of year 12, you know, we've got there the second bullet point, confirm pathway interest. You know, I think from me personally, and I don't know for you two if it's different, but ideally that's kind of already happened. And that's kind of what that year 12 application of, you know, developing performance habits is. But I think if you haven't by that point, you're still umming and ahhing, and you know that's not a blanket rule, because there's certainly opportunities for people that kind of come into it late. But ideally, you've started to think, okay, this is for me. This is what I want to do. You know, you need to start to be thinking about some goals and how you want to perform and what teams you want to make, and really drill down on setting yourself up for 2 strong years to finish your high school career. But I think really that transition between 12 and 13 in high school, yes, you want to finish exams well, but to me, this is what it's go time. You know, it's if you haven't figured it out by now, you might start to be getting left behind. This is your last window of opportunity to really put in the time and effort that it takes to improve your game at a rate that thousands of kids in the US are improving. And that's sometimes and oftentimes beyond what you see around you here in New Zealand, because you a lot of the time have to be, you know, one of the best players in the country. So you have to set your sights really high. And so that is spending every day working on your game, working on your body, in my opinion, in that off season. I don't think it's too much to ask that, you know, you can still enjoy life and your friends and have a social life. But if you want to achieve this thing, it's going to take a lot of hard work. And that's really where that specialization period, that's what I'm speaking to there. We'll talk over the coming slides around, you know, recruitment timelines, recruitment plans, exposure opportunities, you know, but you should be thinking about at the end of your year 12, you're creating a junior year highlight video that you can start to send out to coaches. You can start to think about SATs and when to take that, because something that you might get caught out with is the SAT date in your year 13 year can often conflict with under 19 nationals and secondary school nationals, which leaves you with only 2 or 3 dates in your year 13 year to actually sit that. And if you want to give yourself 2 or 3 opportunities to get a good score, it's worth thinking about the SAT kind of mid to end of year 12, or at least around the dates that you want to sit it. If you haven't already, I'm not really going through these in order, am I? But if you haven't already, register for the Eligibility Center. And then we'll start to talk about exposure and recruitment in the next slide.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things. One is that there's a reason why top age 17s is kind of that place. And really what I would say is that we would probably have an idea at this point of your athletic profile. So we'd probably have a reasonable idea of kind of what kind of athlete you're going to be, how tall you are, how long you are. There are, however, some exceptions. And I will say that the exception to this timeline is a late developer. So someone who maybe had a late growth spurt, and we've seen, I'm thinking about a guy like Leo Wenham right now, who, Leo was maybe 6'2" or 6'3" in year kind of year 12, and he was long, but he, was not a great athlete. And I do think that, in year 13, he really grew and he got to 6'6", 6'7". If he had maybe been on a strength program earlier, that would have probably helped him a little bit, but he didn't know really what he had, even with his own body. And I do think that there are some exceptions of players who physiologically maybe just might not know what their potential is because they don't know where they're at. And I know I'm thinking about a couple other guys, Kiani as well. But even then, realistically, you should be working on your game, and your game should be good. And realistically, what we would like to see is if you're going to grow late, that's only going to take your level even higher. But if you're a player who is on this call and you're year 13 and you haven't started this process or only just now, yeah, it happens. Sometimes we just don't know. But if you're younger than year 12, or you're working with a kid who's quite young, we want to be thinking about this timeline. That top age 17s is really that time where we have an idea of how good you can be, and start channeling, even more resources to a college opportunity, if that makes sense for you.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just probably add, sometimes with the girls, it's probably the year earlier, so kind of end of year 11, and just with the recruiting for girls, it tends to be a little bit earlier than the boys. So in terms of offers and interest and stuff, so just a little bit of difference. But I still think that this is a good kind of guideline to follow generally.
And girls mature earlier than boys, so
yeah,
that would make
so we got an idea a bit earlier.
Cool. Okay, Matt.
So this here is just this kind of makes up the basis of a recruitment plan, and really this is an important conversation that I have with families that really puts things into perspective. I think when you start in your year in year 12, and this is kind of a if you're year 12 this year, this is kind of exactly for you. But when you're at the start of year 12, it can feel like a long way away, a potential scholarship opportunity. And in some ways it is. But going through this can kind of, particularly as you get towards the end of your year 12 year, really put things into perspective. So, maybe in September of your year 12 year, you can put together a highlight tape and a bit of a profile around, the mid-season or the kind of core of your season. You haven't maybe had nationals yet, but you can use that to start to make contact with different schools, send out to your coaching network that and we'll get to exposure in a second here, but that can be the starting point for your recruitment, really. Again, kind of touching on those SAT tests, that's what's available this year. You'll see if you kind of miss November and December and you leave it till next year, March 12th is the first one. And then I think you're kind of getting into those. There might be one more before secondary school nationals that you might be able to do, but that's again why you might want to start thinking about SAT tests. And then you might want to, if you've had some bites from schools or even just a reply or two from some schools that you reach out to, you might want to follow up with a highlight tape from playoffs or secondary school nationals or something like that, and start to think about what next year could really look like for you in a detailed way. Who you'll be playing for, where you'll be playing. Again, we'll get to creating exposure opportunities or understanding what that looks like. But again, this is why it's go time, because it's really getting into the detail. That first half of the year, you're going to have a lot of basketball like you always do here in New Zealand, rep school. If you're in the New Zealand program, that's great. Obviously there's scouts that watch and recruit, Asia, Oceania, World Cup tournaments if you represent New Zealand and can get to that stage. And then there's also invite only kind of camps and exposure opportunities, as well as US tours if COVID wasn't around. But that's kind of, again, that period where you're having some early recruitment, some starting to get into contact with schools and really, starting to find out a little bit more about the school, and they're starting to find out a little bit more from you. But what I would say is that in that kind of July window, June, July, August of your year 13 year, that's when you need to be good enough to be a college basketball player, or be good enough to show the potential that you could be in a very short kind of amount of time. So while, at the end of year 12, you could think, oh, I've still got, a year and a half or even closer to 2 years until I'll be on campus. Well, actually, you've got kind of 6 to 8 months to be ready, and you've got this off season coming up, which we're kind of in right now, or starting to get into right now, where you've got to put some serious work in so that when your highlight tape goes out in July, or you get, a coach that watches your high school game or your New Zealand team, you're good, and you're good enough to be recruitable. Once you have that interest, then you can start to get into the evaluation and referral and networking. Potentially, hopefully next year we'll get back into college campus visits, and that's kind of, again, all through the evaluation period and finding out what fits best. We won't go through the work that we've done in terms of assisting families and trying to figure out what is the best situation. That's probably a separate conversation, one that's a little bit more detailed. But just kind of the last parts here is really just understanding the signing periods, and also just emphasizing that while November 22 is often when you'll see, some Division I recruits sign, certainly some other recruits as well. There is that early signing period, often after secondary school nationals, that you'll see a lot of that happening. But for a lot of kids, it isn't. I think about a great example of that is Cruz Parrott Hunt, who was a tall black in year 13. He was playing on the national team, and he, for the vast majority of his year 13 year, he didn't get a lot of interest. He had interest, and certainly would have, if he opened himself up to kind of the Division II level, he would have been flooded with offers. But for someone on the national team to only really being recruited heavily by one school is, in hindsight, quite shocking. So I think just understanding that it's okay if you aren't in a position where, you're getting your door knocked down and, you're not really getting as much interest as you were hoping, because there's a lot of kids that don't sign until the year that they actually head over. We've had 7 or 8 kids in my time at Rosmini sign, and the vast majority of those didn't sign until kind of, February, March, April. And that to us, I think, Vince, Justine, and myself, that's a normal process. But for the family and for the player, that can be a really unsettling process, because you're finished high school, you're in this waiting pattern. New Zealand university, your peers are even starting their first year of university here, and if you don't know what you're doing, that can be really stressful. But I would just encourage you to, you just need to know that is a really sometimes normal, and sometimes it kind of needs to operate that way. Particularly if you think about, a good example of that is in the junior college space, where they're waiting for a lot of schools to kind of figure out their rosters and, who's taken, who's not taken, before they can really press go on a lot of their roster, and sometimes a lot of their international roster. So yeah, don't stress out too much is kind of my overall takeaway from that.
Yeah.
Um,
Sorry, I just wanted to add to, usually after every signing period, there's an adjustment as the college coaches just see who's committed to them and who isn't. So after each of those after the early signing period, you know, if you haven't had interest before or much interest, it could change after that early signing period as well. So, yeah.
I would add a couple things to all this. I mean, this is great. I mean, I think that, you know, really what you're capturing here is the different kind of ways that this can play out. But one of the things that I want to highlight is the importance of really good quality film. In a COVID environment where, you know, I mean, the reality is, and I know Taylor talked about it, you know, in our Zoom call, Taylor Land, but coaches would prefer to see you live in person against players they know. And so, or at least who they have a gauge at. This is why AAU tournaments in the US during a live evaluation period, which is that July period that Matt's talking about, and international events. You know, if you can represent New Zealand and play an international event against Australia, or against another very high level kind of environment, in some cases camps, there are camps that are really well respected, but you know, live in-person recruiting is the preferred method for coaches to evaluate you. If that's not possible, either because maybe you didn't make a team or you couldn't travel, you need really compelling film. And film is the currency for recruiting. You need not only a highlight tape, you need multiple full games where you play well. And playing well doesn't just mean scoring. You got to think about that whole picture that Taylor's talking about. Are you defending? Can you sit down and guard the player in front of you? Are you playing against a team who they kind of have an idea of? Or, you know, are you playing, you know, in a role and in a style that translates to how does your team play? So, you know, when you're going through this process, you know, you certainly want to be capturing film. So I think from a parent's perspective, you know, download those Glory League games when they come. It's better to have too much film than not enough in that sense. And then, you know, don't assume that just because you played well in that game that makes you recruitable, because being good enough to get a scholarship is not the same thing as being good in New Zealand. And I think we, you know, for me, you know, I know this happens a lot in the selection process, but a lot of people think that because someone scored a lot of points in a game, that means that they're worthy of a selection to a higher team. It's not always how many points you score, it's how you played. It's your shot selection. It's your ability to space the court. The good thing that we know, and we've seen this, is that our players play a style that coaches value. And particularly, there's not a lot of players who really understand modern game, spacing, shot selection, movement, cutting. So that stuff is a lot of the stuff that helps. I know Kiani now is at LSU, and his team is playing a LSU Eunice, and his coach has embraced an international style, and he's come in and he's educating his teammates on spacing decisions. And that's because he spent, you know, time with us, and he spent a year with the Huskies learning a style that translates to his team, what his coach is looking for. And so it's really important to know that you know, you've got to be able to be good enough in the games that matter at the time that they're evaluating you. And we need film of that, and because that's what they're going to evaluate you on if they can't in person. So
yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Justine, maybe a question here from the chat for you. The advantages and disadvantages about starting university in New Zealand the year after year 13 prior to the late signing period.
I wouldn't recommend it if you're wanting to go, because it can actually impact on your eligibility. So at NCAA level now, I'm not sure around NAIA. I think maybe at NAIA that there are some rules around, you know, you're allowed to study, but in New Zealand, definitely not recommended. Yeah.
Cool. Maybe it's a good time to transition to the calendar.
Yeah, and I think this is a really great kind of snapshot of what we've been talking about, and it just kind of visually represents you know, maybe a little bit more simply in terms of what you can expect both in your year 13 year, but then also between graduating at the end of year 13 and actually stepping on campus in August of the following year. So, you know, in kind of that March to June period of your year 13, you're kind of that orange line, that could be where, again, you're starting to get some interest, maybe not, but maybe you are kind of getting some coaches reaching out to you, responding to some of the video that you're sending, having some conversations with the coaches that and then that July evaluation period for US coaches is often where a lot of the in-person heavy recruitment is taking place in the US, and that's why so many New Zealand tours are aligned to that period. Heading over there in the New Zealand school holidays in July to play in front of coaches. After that, that's where we get into really active recruitment. They've seen you in person.
Sorry, man, just hold on one second. I want to make sure that people can see, because I'm getting a note that I'm just going to stop share, and then I'm going to reshare again.
Okay.
Make sure everybody can see it. I'm not sure what happened.
Mm.
Can you see it now?
I can see that. Joss,
Yeah,
can you?
I can. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess kind of, again, off the back end of that year 13 year, starting to really get into the detail of the recruitment, evaluating those 3 or 4, pieces of the equation, the basketball, the academics, the lifestyle, asking questions, getting to know more about the situation where you could potentially be spending the next 4 years. And hopefully throughout that period being in a situation where you can actually compare and contrast across multiple schools. I guess that's, I think that's the goal for any potential student athlete, is to be in that situation. Not always the case. Again, the vast majority of the players that I've worked with, haven't had that luxury, or maybe not to have, a lot of similar opportunities to choose from. But I think every opportunity has obviously a lot of really great positives which they've taken. So that black period there, I think, is off the back of my comment before around being patient. That is when the US basketball, the US high school basketball is in season. So when we're just finishing up, they're kind of getting right into the thick of things. Not only their high school players, where they're getting evaluated, and that's kind of forming a lot of the decisions that colleges are making, but also around the colleges themselves, right? So the recruiters, the assistant coaches, the head coaches are busy, and they don't have as much time to put towards recruiting, and particularly recruiting internationally. But there is that window after that period. Most teams will finish up in February, early March, that don't make the tournament. And again, they're starting to figure out what their roster is looking like for next season. They may have a few openings. They may have a few kids that they're waiting on their decisions that will impact what spots are available. And there's that late signing period in April, May of the year that you would typically head over to the US.
I'd add one thing too, Matt. I think one of the things, so that basketball season is also the college basketball season, although some teams will extend later. March Madness, if you get into postseason play, it can go into, deep into March. You make a run deep into March, but coaches get fired. and coaches who didn't recruit you in the early signing period, they get fired, and then a new coach comes in, and they're looking to build a program in their vision. And players transfer, players leave. So the thing about this timeline is, yes, while it would be ideal to get recruited, in the year 13, to get an offer to sign, in that early signing period in kind of November, and be done and dusted. And we've had guys do that, Tane and Zach and Samaninga, and now, Flo's done that. There is also lots of opportunities that present themselves because of this kind of changing of staff, changing of players, changing of rosters. And so, that period, I agree with Matt, historically in my advising of families, the intense period is after the American season ends, before the light signing period. So that March, April, May period is the intense period where the offers come. And so you can kind of see how if you're a year 13, I suppose, and you're like, there is a chance for me a little bit because, you know, I'm done with high school. I've got a summer to train and work on my body. Maybe I can get into some rep level competition in the early part of my postgraduate year and get some quality film that can get me recruited. And I know that's exactly what happened for Kiani in terms of him getting recruited, because he had no offers coming out of our trip to Vegas the previous year. And so that does happen. That definitely does happen. And the ideal from my perspective is to have 3 schools genuinely interested so that you can have a genuine standard of comparison. And then you can pick the one that's best. If you can get 3 schools that like you, then I think you've won.
Yeah. Just, have you got anything to add on that before we look
to wrap up?
No, I mean, I just one recommendation. If you did have kind of light interest before, you know, kind of in that early period, and sending, you know, a note to the coaches during the season, just saying, you know, showing interest or kind of wishing them luck, or if they do well in a big game, it helps to kind of keep them, you know, keep you in their front of mind.
Yeah. Okay.
Nice.
So we'll move on to this
Yeah.
page. Yeah.
We'll look to wrap up here. I mean, I guess this is just a kind of summary of the previous slides.
Yeah.
You know, there's probably not too much to add. I'm just trying to kind of run my eyes over that to see if we've.
Yeah, not much. I mean, maybe do you want to talk a little bit about outreach? You know, the process of connecting to coaches.
Yeah, well, why don't we chat about that with the next slide?
Okay. Yep.
So I think this is a really important slide too, in terms of, you know, the conversation that I have with my players and my families is around, especially in a COVID environment, it can sometimes just feel like an uphill battle to think about where we can get started. But again, this is a kind of a little snapshot of a current year 12 in terms of thinking about what type of exposure opportunities can I create or can I participate in to be recruited. So that's the events that I have coming up. And that might be evaluation in person, like Vince said, whether that's a BBNZ tour, an international camp, or an exposure tour to the US. Or it could be the game tape that forms a highlight tape or a full season game that you send over to the States to different coaches. And that's obviously the more of the domestic stuff there around the school and rep season. In the past, you know, and I think it'll continue to grow, the secondary school nationals that we've, you know, unfortunately haven't been able to have over the last 2 years. That's a growing evaluation event that colleges and that coaches are aware of. You know, there are a handful of schools that know New Zealand players intimately, you know, that have depth charts on us, you know, going over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And sometimes those schools are often in attendance at secondary school nationals. And then I think the other piece to it is just kind of the networking. And I think this is where my advice is, you know, you can really take control of your future by doing a lot of the work yourself. Don't get too worried about, you know, what you can do or the networks that you actually have access to. Think about your high school coach, think about your rep coach, think about other rep coaches in your association. Think about your New Zealand coach. There's coaches across the country that have their own contacts that we don't know. So utilizing every single connection that you have could be, you know, the difference between a coach, you know, watching a highlight tape that, you know, you might send, but they'll just kind of pass over in the 50, you know, that they get a day, versus a coach that they trust here in New Zealand that sends them it via WhatsApp, for example. So I would lean on your high school coaches, rep coaches, New Zealand coaches, talk to them about your goals and why you want to go, and ask them for their help. You know, will you help me get in front of coaches? And I think most people would say yes. And then those last two, you know, there are specialists that know what they're doing. You know, I think Justine's obviously a great example of that in the women's space. I mean, I think she's just, there's probably not too many girls that are over there right now that haven't lent on Justine in one way, shape or form. And obviously, you know, Vince and I do similar things with Harbour in Auckland and other kids in New Zealand. But, you know, there's other people too. You know, Chris at Lead Scholarships has obviously had a ton of success with placing kids. And then you've got your recruitment services like NCSA. But my final point on this slide is, I think when families sign up to a recruiting service, and you know that could have been CCR a few years ago or NCSA now, that's one piece of the puzzle. It's probably not the best plan, you know, to be reliant on just NCSA sending out what really at the end of the day is kind of cold emails to a database and hope that the right person opens it. You know, I think if you look at this slide and you understand the exposure events, and then really tap into the network that you have, or that you could grow to try and convert the tape or your game from playing into getting in front of the right coach's eyes, that would be my advice. And if you're looking for some really, I thought some really great insight from a recruiter. I thought Taylor's talk, our first series, he had some great stuff in there, some great tips and tricks around just what they're looking for and how they kind of go about their process. So, yeah, that's kind of me.
That's awesome. We are basically have gone through most of our content here. Are there any other questions that people have? And again, don't hesitate to throw them in there. You know, I would say that the one thing that's probably not on the events list is the NBL. And I do think that we've seen definitely in Zach and Tane Murray's case, that was helpful video. You know, that league is getting better.
Even on the women's side, Vince.
100% on the women's side. I know Flo's video, and that, you know, the more our leagues improve, the more that they gain stature around the world. And so they are probably at a point where they're being actively used in recruiting. So on both the men's and the women's side. So, you know, I think that that's a piece. Now, obviously not accessible to everyone, but just something to know. Yeah, Chris doing a great job. I think, you know, part of it is finding the people who are connected to the network that's your level. And I personally would be happy to talk to any family in our community for certain. You know, anyone else who wants to have a chat, but, you know, get someone to honestly evaluate your film, who knows coaches, and if they think that you're good enough, then they'll advise you and connect you to the people who fit. I know we're trying to grow our network all the time. So look, we'll kind of turn to wrap up now, because I know we've kept you for quite a bit, and there's so much more we could review, but we just don't have all the time in the day. So I'll kind of transition now to a few final points, and Matt and just kind of jump in. I think part of the things we wanted to communicate to you, one, you know, and I said this at the beginning, the pathway is not guaranteed. You have to be good enough from a basketball perspective to be able to play there. Now, that doesn't always mean scholarship. You could be good enough to play on a team at a level that doesn't offer scholarships. And there are lots of those. So think a little bit about financially, you know, what you, as a family, we didn't really talk about finances a ton, other than probably to say that most scholarships at the Division I level are fully covered, but at every other level, they're usually partial. And that would be kind of, you know, covering tuition, for example, or room and board. And depending, you know, I know we've had a couple players end up in situations where they're getting their fees covered, but they have to cover their room and board. And that ended up, you know, being somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 grand per year. In other cases, it can be a lot more depending on what region of the country you're in. You know, there's a lot of very expensive schools. But again, hopefully, you know, if you can get some aid, not just basketball wise, but academically, that always puts you in a situation, but it's not guaranteed. If you want to increase the number of options you have, engage the process early. So make sure, you know, get on the academics, take the right courses, do well in them, you know, do well on the SAT. One thing I will say about the SAT is we are hearing that there is a recommendation recently to ban the SAT from, or not require the SAT from NCAA admissions. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I'm happy to talk about, in some other context. But I personally still recommend the SAT for international recruits because even if it's not required, it will still be reviewed. And for a school that's trying to determine if you're academically strong enough, it's a good way of standardizing your level. But engage the process early academically, know the courses you're taking, do well in them. We've seen students get more. If you can do really well academically, you can create channels to schools that are not available for other people. The thing that people need to know is that, particularly at the scholarship level, there aren't a lot of really good students who are also really good basketball players. There are a lot of really good basketball players who are not good students. And there are a lot of really good students who are not good basketball players, but finding that combination is rare. So if you can be a strong student academically, there were schools who wouldn't touch a player whose GPA was below a certain level or SAT was below a certain level. But if you can do well, then that opens up opportunities. We really want to encourage players to drive as much of this process. I know there's a lot of parents on this call, and you want to be supportive and you want to engage, but have the player make their own video. Have the player do as much of the writing of emails. Have the player set up their profiles. We want to be in a situation where the player is driving their recruitment and they own it, and parents are not the ones driving this process. It needs to be the player's vision. It needs to be the player's dream, and they need to have some sweat in the game. And so we really encourage players to drive their own recruitment. That includes asking questions of people like me or Justine or Matt. You as a player need to be realistic and clear about your game. This document on the right is a document that was given to me a couple of weeks ago by Brianna Finch, who's an assistant coach at Boston University, which is a Division I school on the East Coast, and she's the head of recruiting for that school. And I was talking to her about our talk with Taylor Land, and one of the things that she said is like, "Hey, I've got this document that we create. This is what we're looking for." So we've got resources. There are some things here that are important to know. Are you athletic enough? She's looking at each position by size. That's kind of how they look. Are you big enough and athletic enough to play at our level? And, I think that's something that players need to be realistic about. The other thing they need to be realistic about is, what is your value add for a basketball program that wants to win their conference? What is the thing that you're going to do that's going to help them win their conference? And that's how they think. And I think that for you to be realistic about your value add, particularly as you get into that year 12 period where you're like, what am I as a basketball player? I think that's where that process of having spent, summers really reflecting on strengths and weaknesses, adding skills, getting to a point where your height and your size matches to your skill level. And now you have a kind of a pathway for a position and an identity for a position. So be clear about your game and your level. And then once you have some sense for the range, find a school that's going to allow you to play basketball at a high level while going to school and enjoying the college experience. And I think that, there are lots of places to do that. Don't get caught up too much in level and impressing everyone about getting a scholarship. Go somewhere where you're going to enjoy 4 years of being a student athlete. Yeah, that's it. That's me. Matt and Jess?
No, I think, thanks for staying with us. Might have been a long one, but hopefully there's, a bunch to take away from there. Again, we'll be sending this out, the copy of the video, a few additional resources that we've touched on, plus a copy of the slides. So, like I think Vince and Justine said, would be happy to help answer specific questions, that might be for your situation, specifically to you. We understand, the more we do it, the more we realize how difficult it can be. So there's no silly questions. So just appreciate your time. And anything from you, Jess?
No, I think you guys have covered it. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, I can see some folks exiting. Fair enough. Thanks for hanging with us. you know, this is a journey. And again, if you're a coach here and you've trying to educate yourself as well, you know, reach out, ask questions. There are lots of people who you know, are willing to help you, you know, do your part in the process. So thanks again for your time, everyone, and hope you have a good night. We will post this on YouTube as we've done with the others. And when Matt sends out his email, we'll include some other resources in there as well. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Jameer's still on.
Harmy. It's in the other room.
Hey, Leah.